Hello everyone. My name is Jacob Friedman, and welcome to Cutting Through the Noise, Episode 2. I'm really excited, and there was a bit of a curveball. Just like in security, there's unexpected situations, and a pivot had to be made. But the famous quote said, "There's no crying in baseball." And a new challenger stepped up to the plate, came highly recommended from one of my other connections within healthcare, and he's been in cyber for over 11 years. But he started in offensive security and eventually pivoted and now manages the advanced detection and response team at the University of Kansas Health System. I'm really excited to have him on, and we have an exciting conversation for today. So without further ado, please welcome Eric Guillen. Hey, Eric, welcome on, man.
Hey, Jacob. Hey, by the way, I love that baseball reference. I'm a big baseball fan, so love that.
Appreciate it. It's happy to hear that it wasn't a swing and a miss.
Yeah, we're not looking at strike throwing right now. We're swinging the ball, swinging the bat.
That's good. Well, speaking of swinging the bat, there's a bit of whack-a-mole going on these days. You being on the defensive side, I wanted to roll it back. You had an interesting aspect when we chatted yesterday that you started on the offensive side, and I kind of want to start with, a lot of my viewers might be wondering, why did you get into offensive cyber, and what eventually sparked the change?
Yeah, man, what a great question. It's funny because when I first got into cybersecurity, I got lucky enough, right? Because I back then it was called information security. So I got a job in the cybersecurity program at this company, and I did firewall management, risk assessments, architecture review, and everything, which was fun. I mean, you learn a lot from that, aspect. But one thing that I kept on hearing was vulnerabilities and exploits and stuff. And I was talking to the manager at the time, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm manager of the vulnerability management team, and we do this and that." And I was like, "I would love to join that team." So I got an opportunity and I joined it, and which was great because I'm running scans both at the web application level, network level, and I'm sending out these reports to people for vulnerabilities that need to be fixed. And I kept on getting the questions like, "All right, but like, why should I fix it?" And that's a great question. Well, it says critical or it says high, and that's probably what you should fix. And then they're like, "Yeah, but you can't exploit that, or that would never happen. No one ever target that vulnerability." And I was like, that's a really good point. Let me learn some stuff really quick. So that really got me interested in not only the identification of vulnerabilities, but like how can they be exploited? What kind of impact can be caused from exploiting those vulnerabilities? So I started learning just hacking, right? Like web application testing, network testing, mobile testing, just like learn it all. And again, I got lucky, was able to then pivot over to the offensive space. So I did offensive security for 8 years, everything
Wow.
from pen testing to red teaming. My passion is web application testing, but yeah, I just love the fact that you're telling people to fix things, right? These vulnerabilities are everywhere, but why and what can actually be done with them? And there are obviously criticals out there that should be patched immediately, but then same time some of these low medium severity items that aren't a big deal, but if you chain them together they can actually cause something really big. So learning all of that, all those techniques and everything, and then actually exploiting them was the main driver. Because again, people are saying, "Hey, can you fix this?" Or
Yeah.
better yet, "Why should we fix this?" And here's why. Because look what happened when I did something bad to it.
And articulating why is super important. I had a buddy that worked at EY as a pen tester. And, one of his complaints was that he would come back to these clients on an annual basis, perform the pen test, give them their readout of things they need to change, and he'd come back the next year and the exact same vulnerabilities would be present, or at least most of them. So I guess articulating the why is important. Did you ever experience that in your time being on the pen testing side?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, some things are difficult to resolve. It's one of those things where you try to justify, the business case as to like, "Hey, this is something that you should prioritize as an organization." And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's one of those things where you're trying to let the business understand the impact, and you can only say so much, and they're only going to remediate so many things. So certainly there's things that have been lingering for a long time, and you know, either you can put a compensating control in place, or segment the network or something to help kind of mitigate what is being exposed, which is what we always try to recommend if you can actually like patch the vulnerability, because there's times where it's like, yeah, you patch this, and they're like, well, the downtime would affect this. We can't go down for this particular reason, or this thing, like, I'm in the medical space, like this device, like, it's an MRI machine, like it's kind of difficult to fix this, multiple reasons why, but right, but like some things are just more difficult in a lot of cases, again,
Mm.
depending on the organization. So if you can at least kind of give those recommendations of, well, okay, so you can't fix it, but can you do this other thing that will at least prevent it from being even reached? And that's what we strive for. So, but yeah, it's difficult because, like you said, there are organizations that just have that same thing over and over again, and it's kind of that, and you have to exploit it again. You have to, because you're
Yeah.
trying to show like how bad it is, and if it kind of gets bubbled up enough times, hopefully they actually do something.
And that's the other thing is that, I mean, to your point, pain is a great motivator, right? That's when you'll start to get a little more focus, a little more funding, a little more buy-in from leadership. But, the death of many security projects are due to business disruption, right? And there's certain things that the flow of business and the way that they, for you provide, care to these people that need it. If it's going to cause an interruption with that, there's certain levels of risk that they just have to accept, right?
Exactly.
We have an interesting question in the chat, and I know I wanted to bring it up later, but it's a hot topic, which is ransomware. It's very ripe, especially within the healthcare space. So, Mad Dog Prash said, "What do you think will change the senior management's approach to security in the world that we live in right now, where ransomware is ripe?"
Oh man, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, ransomware is a thing. It's going to be a thing if people or companies keep paying it, right? Because that's how ransomware is. Like you're saying, pay this amount of money and we'll give you your systems back, or we'll give you your data back, or whatever. And if you pay it, then people will keep on exploiting that. So it's going to come down to just being proactive, and say that time and time again with security. It's trying to prepare for something like that to never happen. So I mean, if you can have good backups, obviously that's one of your best options. Obviously now, these ransomware groups are doing double extortion, so they're not only
Mhm.
encrypting your data, but they're also stealing it and then saying, well, we have it too, so pay this money and we won't actually leak it out or sell it out to someone else. So it's difficult. Preventative security is kind of what we always strive for: defense in depth. Try to minimize impact, right? So if someone were to land on your network, can you detect that early? Can you somehow set up automation to isolate what has been reached, and trying to get ahead of it and
Mm.
explaining that to leadership, right? Because a lot of times it's, well, we need a new firewall, for example. We need a new firewall. It's like, all right, well, that firewall is going to cost $2 million. And they're like, we're not going to spend $2 million. All you guys are asking for is security, is to spend, spend, spend.
Mhm.
But if you can then start throwing like money around, well, okay, if we don't get this firewall and, ransomware were to happen initially through that firewall we don't have, now they're asking for $20 million. And now you can say, okay, well, would you rather spend 2 million now or 20 million later? Um, they start to understand at that level. And a lot of things too, just within incidences within cybersecurity, it's that reputational damage that you
Mhm.
need to always account for. Um, you know, Having your data stolen and IP and all that stuff is one thing, but then like after the fact, your customers need to keep trusting you, and how can you mitigate that as well. So having those discussion with senior management is really the way to go, with just trying to understand things at the business level, because that's all they care about. Not all they care about, but that's big influencer for them, right? Is keeping the
Yeah.
business up and running, making money, getting new customers and things like that. And as a security professional, you're just trying to talk that same language with them.
And to your point, that's why there's a sector of the market really starting to flower, which is cyber risk quantification, right? How do we attach dollar signs to it so that the the business side starts to understand the risk that we're being exposed to, right? If you just, relate it in technical terms, no one's going to understand you or care. And that's a pretty significant problem right now. And another aspect is that, security is essentially around loss prevention in most cases, unless you're trying to, a client landing is dependent on you achieving some certification or whatever. There's other areas of technology that businesses will throw money at, like contact center, anything that's like revenue generation. But, security still has that stigma where it's hard to always quantify ROI immediately without having seen the other side of the fence, where it really does start to get bad.
Yeah. And you have to kind of look around you. What's going on around you? What kind of business are you operating as? Are you, selling widgets? Are you doing health care? Are you, a bank or whatever? And start looking at your neighboring companies. Like, are they getting attacked? Are they getting this? Or what's happening in that regard? I mean, right now, the healthcare, that sector used to be off limits. Let's be frank. Like, the whole rules of engagement, the whole rules of war, like just don't go after people, don't go after hospitals, don't go after schools. Like that's just off limits, right? But now these bad guys are starting to target it, and it's for a number of reasons, obviously, mainly because of the pressure that these hospitals have when getting attacked, and then they have to, either pay or be down for X amount, thus impacting patient care and lives and everything. So, especially in the healthcare sector, we see, these hospitals kind of getting targeted right now. So that's also a conversation you can bring up. It's like, guys, it's happening. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And are we prepared? Do we have a response plan? Do we have something to help mitigate this? Or all these things you need to bring up ahead of time because, again, unfortunately, it's not a matter of if, it's when.
Yeah, and rules of engagement has changed. You're spot on with that, and it's pretty sad to see because you're no longer just bankrupting a single entity, but lives might be at stake. We've seen it, and I'll bring up some other relevant, timely examples, but it all stems back to ransomware being a business. They have a business that has been proven to get them paid, right? And they have the ransomware as a service model where they've segmented it, and it's pretty interesting on the dark web because one person can get the foot in the door and sell that little backdoor access to another person who can do a little bit more and sell where they got their little checkpoint. And so it's pretty sad to see, but it's almost kind of predictable because you understand which industries are paying the ransom or are really forced to versus other ones that can afford to wait and just deal with it. And healthcare is definitely one where when people's lives are at stake, you got to get the quickest fix possible.
Yeah.
But it also brings back to another issue that you brought up earlier with double extortion, because just because you pay them and they unencrypt everything that they've encrypted on your end, if they're extorting you with data that they've stolen, what's going to stop them from extorting you at a later date if you've already paid them to not release it? They have the data, right? So I guess how do you see that playing out in the future?
Unfortunately, I mean, these are criminals. These are bad guys, nation state actors. These are people that have an end goal, whether it be money, financial related, information related. Trying to steal the data for their own gain to do something later on. And because of that, they're let's be honest, they're criminals, right? And they're terrorists, and you don't negotiate with them. Unfortunately, like you
Mhm.
can't, and you can't trust them. You can't say, all right, well, here's $2 million, and there's like, yeah, we promise to not leak it, or we promise this. Like, can you really
Can you
trust
trust
that?
them? Yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately, what again is preventative. I mean, the thing is, like, once they have your data, there's no telling what they'll do with it. It's something you have to decide as a business. I mean, are we just going to eat this loss? They have 4 terabytes of data, and what type of data we don't know because maybe we don't have a good way to monitor, what databases were accessed or whatever. But having a way to maybe make it so encrypted to where if something were to be acquired, they just can't even read it. Like the whole CIA triad, of security is kind of based on that, right? The confidentiality of data, like only the people that should be able to read it can read it. And if you kind of keep that mindset to where it's like, okay, well, data at rest is encrypted. So
Hmm.
unless they somehow steal the decryption key of your own database, even if they steal that big blob of stuff, like they can't read it. So maybe looking at it in that type of way to where, making it unreadable for them unless, they have that decryption mechanism that you use as a company. So could
Yeah.
be an option. I don't know.
And that whole need has really started to bolster the market. There's been some big funding announcements within the data security posture management space, right? Because data is everything, and you're trying to control who has access, where, how, all the different things. And there's a lot of interesting controls being put around data these days, as well as getting a better understanding of where it even lives, which is also a problem for many leaders. But there's some upcoming disruptors that give me hope. There's one that can potentially allow you to remotely revoke access after it's even left your environment. And that's exciting. But once again, that's part of security, is that it's always a cat and mouse game of innovation on both sides. You build your wall a little bit higher, the actors figure out, how to open up a new door, right? And then you secure that door and they're going to figure out a new place. So I guess, do you ever see a situation in which the threat actors are just not going to be able to match the pace of innovation? Or do you think that the red tape on the defensive side is always going to keep us playing catch up?
It's one of those things where as society, we develop new ways to make things better, right? And maybe better to make things more efficient or more secure or whatever it is. But
Hmm.
if you put your black hat on or your bad guy hat on, you might be able to find a way to leverage that same technology against us. And I think that's always going to be the case, no matter what. Like in the case, let's take AI, right? That's kind of been a hot thing
Mm.
lately, to where, yeah, we can use AI to really help us with things. Maybe on your endpoint detection and response, you know, um, agents. There's able to way to like say, oh, this is abnormal activity, or we haven't seen this after the past 6 months. Now this thing is happening. Let's automatically block it or whatever. And which is great, right? Like these are great technologies that we're using to
Yeah.
hopefully get ahead of the bad guys. But then these bad guys are using AI for that exact same reason. They're either
Hmm.
developing tools quicker, they're leveraging that whole artificial intelligence knowledge to be able to come up with just unique ways to bypass things. Um, they can spend more time doing research and development and less time on, setting up their infrastructure because they now use, AI to help with that. So it's, I think it'll always be a cat and mouse game, unfortunately. How the old saying goes, like, what's the best way to secure a computer? Well, don't own a computer. Okay, what's the second best way to secure a computer? Don't plug in the computer, right?
Yeah.
Oh, what's the third way? Okay, if you have to plug it in, what's the third way? Well, just don't turn it on. And these are all options to make you, secure. But at the same time, life is kind of computer based now, and it's the internet, and it's all these things, and we're going to have to use these things. And unfortunately, with that adds risk. And yeah, it's tough.
I liked the point that you made earlier about thinking like a hacker. Do you feel like your time spent on the offensive side has made you a better defender?
It has. I think so. I always think that, so for the longest time, I was doing offensive security and I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like I'm the hacker guy, and which I love. Don't get me wrong. I did it for so long
Mhm.
that it was a thrill. I loved every minute of it. But then as I'm talking to the blue team, or I'm talking to the threat hunters, or all these people that are on that defensive side, like they're thinking the same way I am. They're not actually hacking. They're looking at it more from a defense point of view. But they're doing the same thing, just kind of a little bit differently. So with that, I would say yes. My time on the offensive security realm has helped me a lot with understanding maybe how we defend against these bad guys. What would be a typical technique if they wanted to move laterally, or if they wanted to target a particular person using open source intelligence or whatever. Like I kind of understand that whole mindset, so I can say, okay, well, we should look in these areas if an alert goes off, because if I were a bad guy, I would go in this particular thing. But I think a lot of blue teamers are seeing that same thing. Like they're learning all the techniques of a bad guy
Mm.
because they're trying to defend against it. So, and not quite to your question, but like I do think there's so many similarities between offensive and defense that if someone wanted to move from one role to the other, it's not as big of a leap as you think. And I think I'm kind of a good example. I mean, sure, I went from, managed or, individual contributor to management, which
Hmm.
is different in a lot of ways. But um, I'm able to take the knowledge that I learned from that side to this side, and it has helped a lot.
Yeah, that's great to hear, and I like that you're, kind of emphasizing for those that may be listening. It's not that scary of a leap, and you're
Yeah.
able to make that. There's a lot of transferable knowledge. So Prashant has brought another question to us, and we might have already touched on it a little bit, talking about cyber risk quantification, right? How do you speak the language of a business and put risk in a format that they fully understand the severity of, so that they're willing to apply budget to? But Prashant has asked, what's the best way to educate the users of the cybersecurity, or the risk of cybersecurity, without belittling or confusing them? How do you get them on board with your protection initiatives?
Right. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to talk to people so they understand, right? Because the last thing you want to do is use all this like cybersecurity jargon, like, oh, SSL and DDoS and encryption and all these things, and they're like, "Zzz," doesn't make
Yeah,
sense to me, right?
exactly.
But if you kind of put it into something that they understand, like I always like to say things as a house, right? Like, our network, our company, our whatever, our computer, think of it as a house. These bad guys are trying to find ways to break into your house, whether it be through the front door, whether it be through the garage or through a window. And you want to protect those places of your network. If they get in, what would a bad guy try to do if they broke into your house? Well, maybe they go to find your safe. Maybe
Hmm.
you have a really nice TV, like that's your crown jewel, that's your intellectual property, whatever that thing you're trying to protect. And are you protecting? Are you leaving it on the kitchen tables for them to see, or are you hiding it somewhere to make it more difficult? Um, and it's the same concept. I mean, these bad guys get in, they naturally go towards certain things because historically that's the place to go. Like if they're trying to steal your car, maybe right by your garage is a key rack with your car keys. So, do you want to put that there? Well, it's convenient, but like maybe you shouldn't put it there. Maybe you should put it somewhere else. And explaining things like that, cybersecurity is very relatable, right? Because like we're stealing a lot of things from the real world. Cybersecurity isn't anything new. When you're trying to protect a building, physical security is very similar in a lot of ways. It's just now information rather than physical objects. So I like to kind of relate it in that way. So educating the users, like, hey, would you put 1, 2, 3, 4 on your garage pin? Maybe you do. Maybe you shouldn't though. Like maybe
Yeah.
something else. And what could help you remember that? I mean, your birthday might not be the best thing, but there's other ways to get, to memorize something or to have something more secure. So it's kind of just talking on their level. Again, not their level in a belittle way, but like in their level as in they don't do this every day. We do this every day.
Yeah.
How can we do so like if they were to talk to us, we would expect the same thing. Like if a doctor's talking to me about something, I'm like, talk to me like I'm a third grader, right?
Yeah.
Or like my 5-year-old son. Like talk to me at that level because I'm not, you know, too good to have something dummy down. And hopefully you can explain it in a way to these users that they get that and they appreciate that. Because again, you're just trying to educate them, you're not trying to belittle them.
And to your point, like, I think that's why analogies are so important. You had the great example of the garage pin. My previous guest, Ron Eddings, he was really into the power of storytelling, and how you can convey points from across industry, regardless of your background, and get people on the same page. And I use a similar analogy sometimes with when I have to consult for like an SMB customer, where it's like we're not looking at projects or products that are going to save you from someone parachuting in through your ceiling. We're just trying to lock your doors and windows first, right? Because you got to start somewhere. You got to put it into a format that non-technical leaders can understand and be like, oh, logically that makes sense. I should probably do that. That's a
Yep.
great point on your end.
Yeah.
So one topic that is pretty hot right now, looping back to ransomware in healthcare, there's a recent issue. Third-party risk is always a big problem, right? Because you can spend all this money on securing your environment, but sometimes the vendors that you grant access to your data and various other things within your environment, they can be at risk. And all of a sudden, if they go down, it's a big impact to your business it makes you look bad. And most recently, there was the Change Healthcare example, right? And so after that happened, people are having issues processing claims, prescriptions weren't getting filled. There's this whole cascading effect of other businesses, not just healthcare providers, but billers and pharmacies, et cetera, that were not able to deliver care because of one attack that had a spider web type of effect. I guess to your point, how do you see third-party risk either growing or getting addressed in the future?
Yeah, it's always gonna be difficult, right? Because you can only do so much for yourself, and you kind of rely on other people to hopefully play the same way to secure themselves, and everything is nice at that point. I think one thing that I did appreciate from the whole Change Healthcare thing was, they did take a proactive approach in
Mhm.
severing connectivity to all their customers, um, to help prevent things from spreading out to, again, their customers and all the other um, networks that might be involved. And I appreciate that, right? Because one thing I know we kind of I wouldn't say struggled with, but it was like that like moment of like, uh-oh, like what kind of business do we have with Change Healthcare, right? And
Yeah.
we're trying to like, because as IT, we don't necessarily know this, so we have to reach out to these other, business organizations to be like, okay, like I heard we use Change, but like at what capacity? So
Yeah.
you're reaching out to a lot of different people within your organization to understand that. So if you can somehow have those numbers and that data available, it'll help at least with the response of it all, right? Because if you know what department is, utilizing this technology with that third party, then you can at least, find out the IP address or the host name or what users are involved or whatever, and then start kind of locking that down to protect yourself. Um, but it is difficult. I mean, a lot of times with these third parties, you trust that they're securing their data. Obviously, we're all vulnerable in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
but before you do business with them, that's why we have all these different compliance, PCI and HIPAA and all these things that you're like, are you HIPAA compliant? Are you PCI compliant? Or whatever data that we're exchanging with each other, are you protecting it in the right ways? So you need to do your due diligence with these third parties ahead of time. You can only do so much, of course, but at least this way you can have somewhat confidence, at least on like, okay, they're doing X, Y, Z to protect stuff. Um, but I mean, it's an eye opener in a lot of ways because, like you mentioned, we couldn't have really prevented anything from our own personal end when
Yeah.
this happened, yet it affected us in so many ways. So, another item that is kind of interesting, I heard recently was, you know, as a business, sometimes you have two internet providers because what if your internet goes down on provider A? Well, at least you have a
Mhm.
backup on provider B, and because that's important to you to have internet as a company. And then something like Change Healthcare, if that's your only company that's processing your claims to make you money, that's kind of an
Single point of
issue, right?
failure.
Do you
Yeah.
really want to have all your eggs in that one basket, or do you want to diversify it out to where you're kind of at least have a backup plan on something? So look into like what is a very important part of the business, and if something were to go down on that, how could we recover? Do we have an alternate plan? All these things that go into just kind of that response capability, is something to at least have a discussion around.
That's awesome. And I know that we could end up talking on this topic for hours, right? Yeah, are
Yeah.
questioners even enough? Right? We could there's so many things that we could have a discussion as far as, the state of third party risk. But as we're coming up to time, if there's people in the audience that want to A, connect with you or be a little, learn a little bit more about your background, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah. So on LinkedIn, Eric Guillen, I forget really what I have, some little funky handle at the end, like G30D4. It
Yeah.
spells Geoda, which is actually my hacker handle. So if you look up geoda-security.com, that's a website that I haven't really updated it too much in a while just because of life. But you can always reach out through there. LinkedIn is a good place as well. But yeah, happy to reach out and answer questions. I mean, I'm also part of SecKC, seckc.org. It's a local hacker group in Kansas City, but nowadays physical location isn't really a big deal. So we have a Discord where you can at least be part of the SecKC community. The main goal of SecKC, which I love, is we're just trying to make everyone better, right? We're trying to keep, I wouldn't say keep talent in Kansas City, because that's a little not personal, but selfish, right? But to grow the talent in Kansas City, and to be able to have people that can talk about cybersecurity openly, freely. We meet up once a month. So if you're in the Kansas City area, would love for you guys to meet up. We meet every second Tuesday of the month. It's a fun group of people. But yeah, we all love cybersecurity.
Awesome. Well, make sure to check it out if you're listening in the audience. And once again, thank you all for tuning in to Cutting Through the Noise. This was episode 2. I'm your host, Jacob Friedman, and we are signing off. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
That's